Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, today we are talking to Sean Jacobs. Sean is a Papua New Guinean-born Australian writer, government relations and public policy specialist, and these days he's located in Brisbane. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Sean.
Hi, Georgina. Thanks so much for having me on.
And Sean, we're having you on today to talk about Monograph, a short book you've written on Neville Bonner. And Neville Bonner was Australia's first Indigenous Member of Parliament. And in the next few days, we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of his election to the Australian Parliament. And Sean, Neville Bonner, as I think you say in your book, he's an incredibly under-acknowledged but significant figure in Australia's history. And this book you've written, I think, will really lift his profile in our history telling of the place of Indigenous people in our politics, the place of Indigenous people in our modern history, but also linking back to their ancient history. And I'm really interested to hear you talk about how Neville Bonner started out in life. His story is an incredible one of resilience, first and foremost, and overcoming severe disadvantage. And the disadvantage couldn't have been more clearly felt than in his early days, even starting with his birth in 1922.
Yeah, that's right, Georgina. So, yeah, he is an incredible figure. I do think he's very under-acknowledged by a lot of our sort of current generation of Australians, and certainly, as I mentioned, a resilient individual as well. I think, what really makes him a great Australian are the things that really stuck out to me and how I came across his story. So I was a young policy advisor at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and I was browsing the shelves for a short book, or thin volume, which I still am guilty of today. And then I came across Bonner's 1979 biography by journalist Angela Berger. And I pulled it off the shelf, and that's until now the only biography that's been written on him. And I was really blown away by three things. And, first, that he was on the centre-right side of politics. He was a conservative, and a member of the Liberal Party, a proud member. But, secondly, he was also from the state of Queensland, which is the supposed deep north, or the Texas of Australia. And,
yes,
and supposedly less cosmopolitan than the southern, more progressive states.
We absolutely, in Melbourne, we absolutely would agree with you. Although we love Queensland for its beaches and great weather.
For sure, that's right. Known for different things. So, and then, third, Georgina, was just that Bonner came of age politically in the late 1960s. And, this, of course, was a time of great upheaval, and street protest and radicalism was really running hot. And he was a figure that defied that trend, and then also a lot of those other assumptions as well. And, he was born into extremely humbled, really harrowing conditions in 1922, as you mentioned. He was born under a tree at Eukaraba Island, which is just on the mouth of the Tweed River in northern New South Wales. And he said that the fact that he survived was really actually quite a miracle, because, not a lot of Indigenous boys and girls survived in those days, especially in those conditions. And, how he went on to serve from 1971 to 1983 in the Australian Senate, I think it's just a great story of resilience, as you mentioned, but then also a great story for Australia as well.
Yeah, I was really struck in your writing about Bonner, the fact that despite so many horrific setbacks, and I was really, really taken by the story you tell of his first attending school with his brother and sister, the experience of racial discrimination that such a young boy of 7 experienced. And yet, we talk a lot about resilience these days, and of course it's such a buzzword when it comes to kids and mental health issues, and we these days have to teach our kids to be resilient because life is so much better than it once was. But the resilience of Neville Bonner through that early experience, and then again and again when he tried to enlist for World War II on 2 occasions and was rejected on both occasions because of his race. These stories you tell, you never get a sense that he carried them as a burden. They really just ended up being part of who he was, and I think I think he says in the biography written of him that he'd had a hard life, but it was good training. Well, what an incredibly strong person to come out of all those terrible experiences and say, well, it was good training. But I mean, Sean, could you talk us through that early experience of Neville Bonner going to school? I think it's so important to understand the strength of character of the man.
Yeah, it was, obviously very, very heartbreaking. It was, he by then he had moved into Lismore, so he had a little bit of time when he was born under the tree at Euchariba Island, but he'd had a very brief opportunity to attend school at South Lismore School, actually. So his mum had actually fashioned a school uniform out of literally sacks, calico flour bags, and for him and his brother, Henry, and they rocked up to school, and probably about after an hour or a couple of hours, most of the school had actually cleared out because the parents, understanding or hearing that there were 2 young black boys at the school, had come and pulled their kids out of school. And so the principal, who'd brokered the arrangement, said very apologetically that the boys would have to go. And, it was a very, very heartbreaking instance in his life. But as you mentioned, Georgina, he had this great quality to persist and to keep going, and regardless of circumstances like that, or racially motivated circumstances like that, really persist and keep going. And if you look at this throughout his life, it kind of galvanized or catalyzed his belief in Australia more. It didn't detract from it, and he didn't become cynical or bitter or resentful about things, but just kept persisting and saw the best in people. And as you mentioned, it symbolised throughout his life, but, particularly when he tried to enlist for World War II in the 40s, he tried to enlist twice with a group of mates and was turned down. But it was just instances like that just showed, how he had a kind of almost meditative kind of reflection on those early years of difficulty as putting him in good stead for facing setbacks. And there's an obvious lesson that a lot of us can learn today around that.
Oh, absolutely. He had obviously with very little formal education, but an extraordinarily strong grandmother and maternal figure in his grandmother after the death of his mother when he was a young boy. And he ended up being a working man, I think he called himself, and a carpenter. He managed a dairy farm and even created his own boomerang manufacturing business, which I thought sounded fantastically entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
But tell me, Sean, how did he end up interested in politics and become politically active? And I guess politically active on the centre-right side too, which was quite the opposite of a lot of the Indigenous activists of the 60s and 70s who went the other way.
Yeah, no, thanks, Georgina. It's a good distinction to make, and that trajectory is really quite important to understand. He found his way into the Liberal Party really in the late 1960s. So in the decades up until then, he'd worked, as you mentioned, every job known to man or every job under the sun. He was cutting chaff, ring barking. He was a stockman for a while. He was a dairy hand. He did everything throughout northern New South Wales and southern and central Queensland. But then he moved to Palm Island for around about 20 years or just under 20 years. And on Palm Island, he he rose to settlement overseer. So he sort of learnt some early political skills, I suppose, about, compromise over confrontation, working within the system, all those sorts of things, also building administrative type skills and really learning, I think, politics on the ground. But he wasn't actually formally political then. So as I mentioned, in the late 1960s, in 1960, he actually moved to Brisbane, but it wasn't until 1967 that he actually formally joined the Liberal Party. And I think if you sort of trace, where he sort of found an ideological home in the party, and especially, he was a fervent believer in Robert Menzies and the statement of liberal beliefs. But you do see throughout Bonner's life this overlap, I think, with a lot of the principles that Menzies certainly stood up for. So around Parliament and the rule of law, he would call the National Parliament the nation's council of elders, and he'd famously say that we want to see more Aborigines in this chamber, and wanting to be part and parcel of the Australian community. When it came to freedom of speech and religion, he said when he went to Canberra that his commitments or his priorities were to God, nation, state, and the Liberal Party as well. And really he was a devout Catholic, but, religion had been his path to assimilation, welfare and integration, and citizens choosing their own way. He had a really good or amicable relationship, or more of respect rather, for some of those people, as you mentioned, Georgina, on the more radical side of the political spectrum, who certainly disagreed with Bonner, very vehemently, but he still had respect for those that probably always didn't have respect for him and respect for good civic kind of discourse. And, he was guided a lot by empathy as well, and protecting people from exploitation, especially Indigenous Australians. And then I think just lastly, he really was a believer, and this loops back to that resilience point about individual initiative and enterprise, and just how important, a good economy was, and sound fiscal management. It really created opportunities for people, regardless of complexion. I think that's sort of where Bonner, I think, sort of philosophically found a home in the Liberal Party, because of those overlapping, principles that emerged throughout his life. But, the actual story of how he actually became a card-carrying member of the party is quite interesting. In 1967, so during the referendum, he was helping Liberal mates hand out how to vote cards at Oxley in Brisbane, or on the outskirts of Brisbane rather. And Bill Hayden, who was the federal member for Oxley at the time, hopped out of his car and saw Bonner handing out how to vote cards. And of course, Bill Hayden was from the Labor Party. And he said, to Bonner, what are you doing? Why are you handing out for that mob? And then Bonner said, well, it'd be pretty foolish if I was handing out for Labor, given that I'm a member of the Liberal Party. And then Hayden just absolutely couldn't believe that, someone on the Indigenous side, or someone with a darker complexion or his Indigenous background, was a member of the Liberal Party, and just stormed off. And later that night, Bonner caught up with his Liberal friends and ended up filling out. He said, pass me the forms, I'll become a member. And I think it was that expectation that because of his complexion, he should be on the left side, or the progressive side of politics, that kind of rankled Bonner a little bit, and I think put him into, at least formalised his commitment to the Liberal Party and conservative principles.
I mean, yeah, that sense of presumption that you are one of us or you're not one of us from that story is, well, it's telling. I can imagine he would have been quite motivated then to to go against what the presumptive position was. He became a senator on the 20th of August 1971 and was nominated by the Queensland Liberal Party the previous year at the half-Senate election, and then when there was a casual vacancy the following year in 71, took that position, and the Queensland Liberal Party obviously pre-selected him into that casual vacancy. And he was in Parliament until 1983, but he didn't. I mean, he is an incredible figure in in Australian history, in Australia, the history of Australian Indigenous people, and of course in the Liberal Party's history. But he didn't end his political career on a good note with the Liberal Party, did he?
No, that's right, Georgina. So there was a lot of bad blood that existed at the time. So he was dropped from first to third on the ticket, the 1983 federal election. So, and, there are a range of reasons that are given for that from speaking to people who were still, around, who were around then. There was, some of them, there was a bit of belief that he wasn't doing enough to court, pre-selection support or get the rank and file behind him. Tactically as well, it was felt by party headquarters at the time in Brisbane or in Queensland that it wasn't, tactically they would do better with Kate Sullivan or Catherine Sullivan and David McGibbon, who were other Liberals ahead of him on the ticket, that they would do better then. And it forced Bonner to really reconsider his formal relationship with the party. So he ended up running as an independent because he knew that if he ran as third on the Liberal Party ticket, that he would have a very slim chance. And he still did well. He courted, tens of thousands of votes in his own right, but he just missed out. And it caused a lot of bad blood at the time within the party. But Bonner, again, as you mentioned earlier, Georgina, he wasn't a resentful individual. There was plenty of opportunity for resentment there, but he eventually came back into the party fold and was given life membership in the 90s. And, I think all was forgiven, but it was certainly a difficult time and a trying time in 1983.
Yeah, well, he crossed the floor of the Senate on 34 occasions, so voting against his own party, which of course is allowed under Liberal Party rules. And you were not automatically kicked out of the party because of that. And he's a strong advocate of Indigenous rights and raised a lot of environmental concerns about mining in the Great Barrier Reef. So that did start to alienate him from some of the very significant and powerful figures in the Liberal and National parties in Queensland. But yes, it wouldn't have been a happy end to his parliamentary career to be either demoted down the ticket or then feeling like you need to resign your position in the party. But post-politics, he became a staunch monarchist and he gave what is probably one of the most compelling speeches in the Constitutional Convention held in Canberra in February 1988. And I wanted to play an excerpt of his speech because it's towards the end of his life. In fact, he dies the year after this in 1999. So he's giving this speech in his very much his twilight years, but it is so passionate in its defence of constitutional monarchy as a system of government that he really respected above all. I mean, Parliament and the democratic system were things that he valued above all other priorities, as you said before. I'll play it now.
But my heart is heavy. I worry for my children and my grandchildren. I worry that what has proven to be a stable society, which now recognizes my people as equals, is about to be replaced. How dare you? I repeat, how dare you? You told my people that your system was best. We have come to accept that. We have come to believe that. The dispossessed, despised, adapted to your system. And now you say that you were wrong. And we were wrong to believe you. Suddenly you are saying that what brought the country together, that made it independent, that ensured its defense, that saw through peace and war, saw it through depression, prosperity. You are saying all this must go.
Incredibly powerful set of words there, and Of course, quite different from most people with his background and his identity. And in fact, I think he was the only Indigenous person at the Constitutional Convention who spoke in favour of the monarchy. But I think the way he pitches his arguments in favour of continuation of a constitutional monarchy is of the contract, the social contract that was entered into by the European settlers with Indigenous people, that we're settling on your land and we're bringing this system and we want you to accept it and be part of it eventually. And now we're telling you, no, we don't even like that system. Actually, it was a bad system after all. Now we want a new system. And he was, as you can hear him say, he said, how dare you? How dare you do this to us?
Yeah, that's right. And I think he was, Bonner was annoyed, really, that the goalposts, like you say, were kind of being shifted once again. He had spent his whole life, really convincing others in the political process that, working within established institutions is the way that you get change done. It's not from radicalism or, trying to turn the systems upside down. And then, to have the concept of Republic Australia floated really ran against, those established institutions, and it moved the goalposts again about, when it came to questions of integration and assimilation, and particularly, convincing Indigenous Australians of the legitimacy of Australia's established institutions. And, the other point too, it's a rather obvious one, but, there is a lot of space for, tradition and continuity, Indigenous culture itself. So I think that's where Bonner really saw the benefits of constitutional monarchy and rule of law institutions. But that system of bringing people together, had emerged under the Crown, and it's what Bonner stood up for. And I think that's why it kind of provoked such a strong or memorable reaction from the 1998 Constitutional Convention, and those words that you played there.
Yeah, and on a big issue that he did focus on a lot, and of course was started to become a very live issue during the Menzies government in its final term in 1963. And in fact, we've just celebrated the 58th anniversary of the Yirrkala bark petitions on the 13th of August, which is the first formal claim for native title from an Indigenous group, the Yolngu people in Arnhem Land. The Menzies government at the time had released some land in Arnhem Land to a foreign-owned mining company, and the Yolngu people protested this through these bark petitions, which to this day are in the Parliament and exist. There are 4 copies of them. In response to the bark petitions, Menzies government set up a select committee to look into the issue around Indigenous land rights, and the committee recommended that there be recognition of sacred sites and compensation for land lost when it was taken from the Indigenous people. And actually, the Yolngu people ended up receiving native title to their land in Arnhem Land in subsequent years, but unfortunately not the mine site. But Neville Bonner was a big supporter of Indigenous land rights, but of course not in the activist sense of some of his equally politically minded Indigenous activists of the 60s. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's a fair distinction, Georgina, and a really good point. He obviously, again, just favoured working within established institutions, which meant within the rule of law, but it wasn't that he was totally opposed to any sort of change. When he became of age politically in the 60s, or he began to learn more about Indigenous land rights issues and the intersection with the law, this is really after he joined the Liberal Party, and he said that, rubbing shoulders with the executive, he learned a lot more. And I do write about this in the book, about Bonner's equality agenda, and what he was really speaking about, or what he committed himself to, was trying to eventually, over time, get rid of or remove that regime of control that governed Indigenous Australians, particularly in the state of Queensland, and he said that he didn't think that protection could be lifted all at once, but it could take 3 to 4 generations for complete independence with no settlements, no special legislation, and no allocation of funds. And what he was really working towards, and this was an admirable goal, was for land rights and native title, but also to be able to use land or private property like anyone else would in Australia, like any other citizen in Australia would. So yes, you could have these, sacrificial sites and things that would have a very important cultural element to them, but then really enabling that private property to be used, for capital, to drive investment, to create jobs and stimulate economic opportunities as you would with private property, without having to jump through so many different hoops. And that was the sort of term of compensation that he was kind of using throughout his parliamentary career, in particular, when you actually unpack it and work through what compensation actually meant. It was more of a focus on that commitment to that equality agenda around, removing that regime of control, but using that to generate opportunities that, as you would, with a private enterprise in any other domain, I guess, in Australia.
How do you think, Sean, he would have viewed the move these days towards Indigenous recognition in the Constitution through the Voice to Parliament and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, this idea that there would be another body that would recommend policies with it from an Indigenous perspective and provide that particular representation to Indigenous people in our nation's governance system? I mean, he famously said he did not want an Aboriginal parliament, and he just wanted more Aborigines in the parliament, like himself. But how do you think he would have received the Uluru Statement from the Heart? He definitely would have been there if he'd been alive, I'm sure, being such an engaged political actor.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think he would have absolutely. I think, like a lot of Australians, see the sentimental value in the statement and the power of it. But I think he would have been very suspicious for reasons, as you mentioned, Georgina, around established institutions being part and parcel, of the Australian community, and seeing more Indigenous Australians in the federal parliament or in parliaments in general. But he did also, when Gough Whitlam set up the National Aboriginal Consultative Council, which was looked at a very similar issue to the Voice. So back in the early 70s, Bonner actually labelled that, and he was very strong here with his language, auto-apartheid. And he said that it would be ludicrous to actually suggest that there will be an Aboriginal parliament within Australia. He always focused on, saying that we had one parliament, and that was Australia's ultimate council of elders. And he did remind a lot of the, radical activists at the time that that's what parliament was there for. It existed, and it was Australia's existing council of elders. So to create another Aboriginal parliament would be ludicrous in his view. And so I think that assessment remains relevant today. He was very strong on that. But, I do think we have to be, cautious about this debate and actually, discovering what's actually being proposed. It's not quite clear yet, but I think, Bonner there would have wanted to see more detail on what exactly it was. But I think at the same time, he would have maintained a very healthy scepticism about a voice. Again, given that the institutions that we already have in place at the moment.
Yes, he was very much a Burkean conservative in that respect, wasn't he? He really prioritised institutions and as a way of preserving rule of law in society, and that they were inherently virtuous. I also think his conception of his own identity too. He certainly was a proud Aboriginal man. He says, "I am fiercely proud of the fact that I am a descendant of the original owners of this continent." I mean, he was a proud Aboriginal man, but he was a proud individual too, and he was very keen that he be considered an individual rather than part of a broader group, an individual first and foremost with an identity of his own, with a set of beliefs that were his own, not beliefs that he had inherited from an identity group. And I wonder how he would have found the rise of identity politics over the last few years. It would have, I assume, been without putting words into his mouth, but been an affront to him who held his individual identity and dignity so close to his heart.
Yeah, that's right. I think, he importantly said that he was in Parliament in particular to not just advance Indigenous issues, but he was actually a senator for all Queenslanders. And I think, that's an important point to recall of Bonner. And as you mentioned, Georgina, his fierce individualism as well. He that lifetime of building resilience and being, part of different communities were really built upon strong individuals, and him being a strong and reliable and responsible individual as well. And, I don't think he could have anticipated the renewal of identity politics and how it's sort of manifested today. But, I think his response would be, again, a very healthy skepticism of identity politics. And I think you picked up on it really well, Georgina. He wasn't in any way being an individual disposing of his cultural heritage or his cultural identity. That was very, very important to him. But he found that how you advance in the modern world and build skills and be a cooperative member of, or decent member of your community and society, is learning to find a balance. This sort of term of walking in two worlds, that's a really, really important one when it comes to Indigenous culture and heritage, is learning to balance your cultural heritage with being an individual in a modern, prosperous free market society. Really requires an actual balance of those identities and those competing spheres. But being able to think for himself too. He always returned to that, not just about the skills he was able to build and the life he'd carved out for himself on the frontier, but being able to make his own decisions and move away from those presumptions that we talked about earlier. That given he was an Indigenous man, that he should exclusively be on the centre left or the progressive side of politics, was also just an affront to that belief or that spirit of individualism as well. Yeah, so I think those points kind of really round out, really healthy but probably fierce opposition to identity politics that Bonner would have if he was still alive today.
Oh, well, I think on that note, Sean, we will finish here, but I do want to recommend your monograph to our audience. It's part of an Australian biographical monograph series that's published by Connor Court, and yours is, of course, called Neville Bonner. And I understand it'll be available online and hopefully in bookstores very, very shortly. And of course, at a very, very important time in around the 50th anniversary of Neville Bonner's election to the Australian Federal Parliament as the first Indigenous member of the Parliament. And what a legacy it is. And thank you, Sean, for sharing it with us and today, but also in this monograph. I think it will really, really improve the understanding and acknowledgement of such a significant figure in Australia's history, and a story that really has not been told enough. So thank you very much for your time today, Sean.
Thanks so much, Georgina, and you're doing great work there, and thanks so much for having me on. And yeah, look, I hope that this moves the needle a little bit in terms of people appreciating a great Indigenous Australian, but a great Australian as well. So thanks for having me on.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.